Hey there everybody, this is Jared the Third with another how-to video. Today I'll be going over how to MagDK. As always, I try to make videos that will be useful for a long time, since builds change so often in ESO. Drop a like and subscribe and follow me on Twitch if you find this helpful. Thank you, and let's get to it. First, we're going to go over the DPS skills that make DKs unique. Understanding your skills, how they work, and where and when they're useful is fundamental in knowing your class and mastering it. Next, we'll go through each class skill line and talk about the different skills that are useful for MagDK. Of course, we have to begin with Molten Whip. It is a staple of the MagDK and will be your spammable 95% of the time. There will be sometimes you trade it out for things like Force Pulse, but you lose a ton of damage doing that. And once we get later into the video on how it all works together, I'll go over ways to maximize what you can get out of this very powerful skill of Molten Whip. Next, with the hybridization of stats, basically, Venomous Claw, the Stam morph, I know, Stam on a mag, the Stam morph will do more damage over Burning Embers. And that is primarily because of, in the description, you see the poison seeps into your target and deals increased damage the longer it lasts, and that is why it does more single target. The Burning Embers morph is a very powerful self-heal and a very strong dot. So you heal for 102% of the damage done with this ability. That is absolutely insane. It's very powerful in solo content. But if you're raiding or in 4-man content and you don't need another heal, Venomous Claw will be your bet. Next, we have Engulfing Flames. And while being a semi-strong ability on its own, it is an absolutely necessary skill for any mag group. That is because it causes targets hit with it to take up to 10% more damage from flame damage attacks. You'll find this in any mag group. Now, with the high isle as it currently stands on the PTS, they are decreasing this to 6% instead of 10% more damage taken from flame damage attacks. Even with that, you will still find the skill in any mag group. Next, we have Flames of Oblivion. This is a strong skill on its own, and for single target, you'll cast it, let it run out, and cast it again. For AoE, it'll work a little differently, and I'll get into that in a little while. As well as, while this being slotted, you gain Major Prophecy and Savagery, and I'll explain how that can work also later when putting it all together. Next, we'll be going over the Draconic Power skill line. First, Burning Talons is a very powerful damage over time ability, as well as sometimes a spammable, which I will go over when that is the case. Second, we have Coagulating Blood. This is a good self-heal if you feel you don't want to use or on top of use Burning Embers along with it. Again, Burning Embers is a very powerful self-heal and a damage ability. But if you feel like you need more or want something different, Coagulating Blood, very good. Next, we have Deep Breath. This is a very strong AoE skill. Typically, it will be used in trash alone, but perhaps sometimes other scenarios. And next, we have the Earth and Heart skill line. Usually, the only skill you'll have from this is Eruption. It's just an AoE ability, really strong, very standard on MagDKs. There are some groups that will ask DK to run Stone Giant. I know it's a stamina ability if there isn't a DK tank. This still does strong single target damage, so don't feel distressed if you are asked to use this. It still does good single target damage. And then even still sometimes, again, if there's not a DK tank, groups may ask a DK to run Igneous Weapons, which will give Major Brutality and Sorcery to your group for 54 seconds. Very long time. So you might as well just level those up too, just in case. Next, we'll talk about using some of these abilities that we just went over, particularly the AoE ones. For a DK, most of their AoE abilities are more circular in nature instead of linear. So for comparison, with a Destro Staff, when you cast Wall, it moves in a line from you outwards, right? Similar with an Orb. It moves in a straight line from where you cast it. With a DK, a lot of those AoE abilities are going to be more circular. So you'll want to position yourself in such a way to be in between targets. So for example, we have Eruption. Notice how it's in a circle around me. We have Deep Breath. It takes a little bit of a cast, hits all 4 of them. We have Flames of Oblivion, which spits out 3 little balls to random targets around you. And then, of course, Talons. You just saw the little talon go out, and the dot is still on them. If I'm standing here and I cast Wall, you'll notice it's only hitting the targets that are in the line in front of me. Same thing with Orb. See, it hit this back one once, twice, 3 or 4 times, but once it gets disappeared. But once it gets kind of further away in the line, it won't hit these ones in the back anymore. And then with Engulfing Flames, this is more linear. It does have a much smaller range, but again, you can target. See, it's hitting 3. Can I hit all 4? Not quite the way I have it set up, but you get the idea. It's kind of in a line in front. It's not AoE based in the or circular based in the sense that it'll hit targets behind you, like Talons would. And now we'll go over the ultimate abilities that you'll be using on a DK. The one that you'll primarily be using is the Standard of Might. It is a very high cost of ultimate ability, but it is very powerful. While you're standing in it, you gain increased damage done and reduced damage taken by 15%. And it also just does good damage to the target inside of it. The only time you won't really be using this is if you won't be able to stay within your standard for the whole duration. Ideally, your target would as well, of course, because it's doing damage to them, but especially if you cannot stay within it for the full 20 seconds. If that is the case, Destro is a very good option as well, as it only lasts for 7 seconds, and it's a high burst ability if you're using a Destro staff on the back bar. And then the third ultimate ability that you'll pretty much be cycling through with the other 2 is Flawless Dawnbreaker in the Fighters Guild line. The reason for this is even having this slotted on your front bar, you gain an increased 3% of weapon and spell damage just for having it slotted. Equally, since it is a much lower cost ultimate than Standard and Destro at 125 ultimate, if you will not have enough time to generate a Standard or Destro, but you have time to cast this and benefit from it, definitely recommend using it. The damage itself is pretty good, but also the main thing for Mag is that you're going to gain 300 weapon and spell damage for 20 seconds after using it. Next, I want to highlight just a couple of the class passives on the DK. In general, just like with every class, you want to have all of your passives because they help you offensively or defensively in some form or fashion. On the DK in particular, 2 I want to highlight: Helping Hands and Battle Roar, that have a little bit of a nuance to them. With Battle Roar, every time you cast an ultimate ability, you restore 51 health, 50 Magicka, and 50 stamina for each point of ultimate cost. So pretty much what this means, every time you cast an ultimate, if you have 2 points in a Battle Roar, you have this massive resource boost. Now, you may notice I only have 1 point in Battle Roar at the moment. That is because with Basse's Mania, the set found in the Trial Rockgrove, you gain the most damage boost from it, a 12% damage boost, up to 12%, depending on how much Magicka is gone. So the lower your mag, the more damage output that you'll gain from Basse. And since DKs have such a huge resource boost, and their sustain is really good now, especially with using some stam skills quite frequently, you'd want to kind of rein in that resource boost a little bit so you don't completely waste your Basse buff by having full mag, for example. So in Rockgrove, I use 1 point. In other trials or other contexts, you might see people running 0 Battle Roar. That is completely to gain the most that they can out of the set Basse's Mania. If that set in the future is not used anymore, then, or if you're not using it at all at the moment, then there's absolutely no reason to not have 2 into Battle Roar. The other passive I wanted to mention, this is more of kind of a tips and tricks sort of thing, is Helping Hands. When you cast a non-stamina costing Earth and Heart ability, restore 990 stamina. This is why you often see DK tanks spamming Igneous Shield or Fragmented Shield kind of randomly, maybe running in between trash packs or maybe a few times in a row. It's completely, because this ability costs mag, it will gain them 990 stamina each time. Now, one trick for a DPS, especially with the change of Eruption, Since eruption only costs 332 mag per second instead of a big cost up front, you can essentially spam eruption running in between trash packs or on bosses if there's like running phases to gain stand back. You'll notice I'm spamming eruption. My Magicka is not going down at all because it's only costing 330 something every time I cast it, and this would be giving me 900 and see what was the 990 stamina each time. So that's kind of a tip. I find that most people don't really realize that. Again, I encourage you to read over the rest of the passives, figure out exactly what they do. I'm not going to go over them all here because you should just have them. Okay, now we're going to try to put it together, and I'm going to explain a rotation. So I mentioned that I would go more in depth with Molten Whip when we're kind of putting it all together. So now is the time. So let's read over this carefully. This is a very important skill for the DK, and it's spammable. So whenever you activate at the bottom there, whenever you activate a different Ardent Flame ability, you gain a stack of Seething Fury, increasing the damage of your next Molten Whip by 33% and your weapon and spell damage by 75 for 10 seconds. This effect stacks up to 3 times. So, Ardent Flame, pretty much what that means is every time you cast Flames of Oblivion, Engulfing Flames, and or Venomous Claw, you gain 1 stack of 33% added damage to your next whip and 75 weapon and spell damage for 10 seconds. So let's see what that means. I'm going to cast Flames of Oblivion. You see there, counting down, that 1 stack will last me for 10 seconds. Pretty much up to 3 stacks. So what this means is that 3 stacks, your tune does that little animation. That animation doesn't mean anything. It just means you use the 3 stack whip. It is the same amount of damage whenever you add 1 stack, 2 stack, or 3 stack. It is always an increase of 33% by your next whip and 75 spell damage. So what that means is if I have a 1 stack of whip and I use it, it was increased by 33% and 75 weapon and spell damage until I use the whip. If I do it by 2, it is 66% and then 150 weapon and spell damage. And if I have a 3rd whip stack, it is 99% and 225 weapon and spell damage. So it doesn't really matter if you cast your whip, whether it's 3 stack, 1 stack, or 2 stack, or a 2 stack and then a 1 stack, or a 1 stack and then a 3 stack, or whatever. It's all going to come out to the same amount of damage. And another trick with Flames of Oblivion is you'll notice I'm up to 3 stacks and I can keep refreshing it up to 10 seconds. If you don't use your whip, you will hold on to the weapon and spell damage buff that you have from those stacks. The only thing that's going to make a difference of using that 3 stack is that you're going to release a much more powerful whip. But if you don't use it, you still have the boost, the boost of weapon and spell damage from the stacks of Seething Fury. Meaning, if I hold on to these 3 stacks and I'm attacking and it's an AoE fight for part of it, let's say any boss that has like multiple targets at the same time, you can focus on some more AoE and allow those 3 stacks to remain. So you essentially are giving yourself a boost of 225 weapon and spell damage while you have the 3 stack of whip. And so the rest of your rotation is pretty much just keeping up your dots and then using whip when you don't need to refresh any dots. You can pre-buff your going into a fight with 3 stacks of whip. That way when you start the fight, you can put down your dots like this. I'll put down 4 dots in a row and then use a 3 stack whip right from the get-go and then keep going. So that is one trick that you can do as well to have like a little bit more of a boost at the start of the fight. One of the things that makes learning MagDK a little tricky is that they really do have a ton of skills at their disposal that are really strong for different purposes and different contexts. So you really need to know, okay, what am I going into and what will then fit that context I'm going into. So my bars at the moment are set up for single target, although you could do 2H on the back bar as well, as I mentioned earlier. and do carve, stampede and carve instead of wall and orb. But I'm just keeping, just for simplicity's sake, I'm doing Desert Staff on the back bar. So you see I do have some cleave oriented things, but a lot of it is single target. So like Barb Trap, single target, Venomous Claw, Whip, of course. Blade Cloak is a very strong single target ability, and it is stronger than Engulfing Flames. Now, if I'll get into this in a little bit for some kind of special circumstances. If you're a Zen DK, you're definitely using Engulfing Flames. There are also some other instances where Engulfing Flames will be favorable, but in general, Blade Cloak is going to do more damage than Engulfing Flames. And then, of course, Scalding Rune as a single target. So I'm kind of set up in that way. So I'm going to do kind of a go through my rotation 2 or 3 times. That way you can kind of see what I mean in terms of keeping up your dots, using your whip when you pretty much have nothing else to keep up. So let's get into it. I'm going to do the pre-buff here, and let's go. And then there's one more thing about Flames of Oblivion that should be mentioned, and that is the timer. It shoots out little fireballs at your target, up to 3 enemies at a time over the course of 15 seconds. So you need to let the timer run completely out, because you'll notice there that it dropped the last flame. A lot of times people will refresh too early and they'll miss out on that very final tick of Flames of Oblivion, which again will eventually be a damage loss over time. It's minimal, but it's a loss nonetheless. So if I cast it now, I miss out on the very last tick of Flames of Oblivion. So I was doing some dynamic parsing with a little bit more single target focus. If you want to go AoE focused, some of it will depend on the gear you're using. There's so many variables, right? But just to try to make it as basic as I can and kind of universal as I can, Talons is always going to be a very strong AoE. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit more circular, so you see it just hit all of them, and you can spam it. It would do a bunch of damage doing that. Again, it's very mag heavy, so you just want to be careful with that. You see I have caltrops on the back of my bar. I mentioned it earlier, anti-cavalry caltrops. I'm using this on this setup because I have Tsogvin, which is a source of minor force. So if you have a source of minor force outside of Barb Trap, then you could run caltrops for AoE. It's kind of a flex spot in that sense. Caltrops is good enough AoE to use it if you can. Otherwise, it's not a big deal. For example, if I wasn't using Tsogvin, which again, if you look at the 5-item line, does give minor force, I would have Barb Trap here. Because I would need that source of minor force. So that kind of gets into some of the versatility, or for example, in Trash, I mentioned this earlier, going over the skills, Deep Breath is a very strong ability. Cast it, and then 2.5 seconds later it blows up. So you can see, even just as I'm running over, how AoE oriented it is. So it kind of does that. I have Talons, boom, right? So it's kind of, you have to be right up in the action here. So those are a couple of the kind of dynamics in terms of AoE orientation for a DK. And also just to mention, you can spam Flames of Oblivion when there's 2 to 3 targets, because it does shoot out 3 fireballs, as you can see. Very powerful. Talon spamming is more damage, but it is very mag heavy. Again, when there's 2 to 3 targets, spamming Flames of Oblivion is a very powerful and much cheaper option. Okay, so I just wanted to show perhaps a little bit of a rotation, kind of applying some of what I talked about. Again, I have Dogvin on, meaning I have a source of minor force outside of trap, so I do in fact have caltrops on my back bar. Also, just as a side note, Deadly Cloak, very strong single target, and AoE when you're all up in their business. So let's see. So this is going to be a little bit of a kind of what I did the dynamic single target parsing. Going to go 2 to 3 times through the rotation just so you kind of get an idea. See, I have 3 targets here, and so let's get into it. There is a special circumstance worthy of mention, and that is the Zen DK. It has been that way for a lot of patches, and what Zen is, it's a set found in Lair of Marsalok. The 5-piece item line says, your light attacks apply the touch of Zen on enemies for 20 seconds. Enemies with a touch of Zen take an additional 1% more damage for each damage over time effect you've placed on them, up to 5%. Meaning, if somebody wearing Zen applies 5 damage over time effects on a target, then that target takes 5% increased damage from everybody else, including you, which is absolutely insane. It is a staple in any organized raiding group. So why does it always go on the DK? You hear people saying, I want a Zen DK, or I can Zen DK, etc., etc. The reason why is because DKs naturally have the most damage over time effects a part of their toolkit. So without adding anything else, without any sort of real damage loss, they have the most in their class abilities. So you heard me mention earlier, if you're a Zen DK, you'll definitely be using Engulfing Flames. Engulfing applies a stack of Zen, as does Venomous Claw. Other classes, if they have a class dot, damage over time ability, they usually only have just 1. DKs have 2, sometimes 3, and sometimes even 4 because they apply burning so easily. So 1 being talons, or the 3rd being talons, 4th being burning, or even poison because they apply those status effects so easily, a part of their natural rotation. So that is why DKs are typically the ones that are Zen. So Trap also applies it. Again, any class can do that. What's really important is to know that Zen, or that DKs have a potential to add, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just on my front bar here, just from their very own class skills. 1 from Talons, 1 from Venomous, 2 from Venomous Claw, because the dot itself, and then the poison status effect, Engulfing Flames, and then the burning status effect, potentially. So in summary, DKs bring a lot to the table, both in single target, AoE, and special circumstances or skills like Zen and Engulfing Flames. They are incredibly dynamic and have been one of my favorite classes to play. I hope this has been helpful for beginners and more experienced players. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.